Tonight, our proclamation is a brief one, taken from Isaiah chapter 66, verse 2, the latter part of the verse. These are the words of the Lord. This is the one I esteem, he who is humble and contrite in spirit, and trembles at my word. Have you ever paused to consider why we should tremble at the word of God? Have you ever actually trembled at the word of God? Did it ever enter your head that you should tremble at the word of God? I'll give you one among many reasons. Jesus said in John chapter 14, the one who loves me is the one who will keep my word. And my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our dwelling with him. So through the word, God the Father and God the Son come to those who love it. Now, if God the Father and God the Son were to come here in visible form this evening, every one of us would be on our faces on the floor. Well, God isn't coming that way, but he's coming through his word. And I want to say that scripture again. This is the one I esteem, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. Now, I have a message tonight which I have never even tried to bring before. Now, this is going to be a very difficult message to bring, and I hope you'll be indulgent. My theme is the Christian factor in anti-Semitism. Probably most of what I'm going to tell you will be totally unfamiliar to you as Christians, and much of it may be extremely shocking. I'll tell you one group of people to whom it is not unfamiliar is the Jewish people. I'm going to be quoting largely from a book called The Anguish of the Jews by Edward H. Flannery. I want to say that I have no special connection with this book. I stand to gain nothing from its sales, but I believe it contains information which most Christians desperately need. Brother Dwight Pryor, who I think knows the author slightly, quoted to me a statement by the author which I can only paraphrase. But he said, this book contains the pages of history which the Christians have torn out and torn up, but which the Jews have memorized by heart. And if you find it sometimes difficult to communicate to a Jew about Christianity, part of the difficulty lies in the fact that they have a totally different perspective on history than you do. And they know a whole lot of things that happened in the past that we as Christians either never knew or have forgotten. So I'm going to do my best. That's all I can say. I'm bringing this message because I believe God wants me to, and I believe it's desperately needed in the church. We've been singing a lot of happy songs, for which I thank God. But I want to tell you, between that happiness and us, there stands something that we have to put right. And it won't become a reality for most of us until we put it right. I think anti-Semitism is a misnomer. I've contested this, but I've given up. It's just no good, because anti-Semitism is derived from the name of Shem, and it means being against Semites. Well, that's not what it is, because many of the Arabs are Semites. Many of the other population of the Middle East are Semites. It's not against them. What is it against in one word? Jews, that's right. It should be called anti-Jewishness. But there's a kind of reluctance in us to face the dirty truth. And so we camouflage it with religious phraseology. Probably anti-Semitism could be traced back to about 200 BC. But I want to deal with anti-Semitism that is specifically anti-Jewish. In other words, it's against people who are Jewish because they're Jewish, not because they're moneylenders or because they have political influence or they control the media, but solely because they are Jewish. There are lots of other groups of people whom some other people dislike. They dislike them for various reasons. But I'm dealing only with the issue of people who hate other people simply because they're Jews. the main enduring impetus that has promoted and strengthened anti-Semitism throughout possibly nearly 2,000 years is the Christian church and Christian theology. There is nothing else in that field that can rival the influence that the Christian church and Christian theology have had in promoting and strengthening anti-Semitism. Now, I'm going to give you some quotations from some well-known Christian leaders who are called saints. Amongst them are Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who lived 331 through 396, Saint Jerome from 340 to 420, who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate version, which is used today amongst the Catholics, but especially amongst a saint named Chrysostom, who lived between 344 and 407. And the ironic thing about him is that his name in Greek means a golden mouth. It couldn't be more ironic. Here are some of the statements that he has made about the Jews. He had a problem because he lived in Antioch, where there was a large Jewish population, and some of his church members were going to the synagogue and mingling with Jews, and he disapproved of that strongly. So he concluded the way to prevent it was to paint the Jews in the most terrible colors so that no one would ever want to associate with them again. And these are just some of the things that this man with the golden mouth said of what to accuse the Jews. Now, these are quotations. Of their rapine, their cupidity, their deception of the poor, of thieveries and hucksterings. Indeed, a whole day would not suffice to tell all. However, he certainly tries to do it. This is how he goes on. How can Christians dare have the slightest converse with Jews, most miserable of all men, men who are lustful, rapacious, greedy, perfidious bandits? Are they not inveterate murderers, destroyers, men possessed by the devil, whom debauchery and drunkenness have given them the manners of the pig and the lusty goat? They know only one thing: to satisfy their gullets, get drunk, to kill and maim one another. Indeed, they have surpassed the ferocity of wild beasts, for they murder their offspring and immolate them to the devil. They are impure and impious. Concerning the synagogue, he said, not only is it a theater and a house of prostitution, but a cavern of brigands, a repair of wild beasts, a place of shame and ridicule, the domicile of the devil, as is also the soul of the Jews. Indeed, Jews worship the devil. Their rites are criminal and impure. Their religion is a disease. Their synagogue again is an assembly of criminals, a den of thieves, a cavern of devils, an abyss of perdition. Now, those are the recorded words of a man who is still esteemed today in the church as a saint and had a great influence in the 4th century of this era. If you come to the matter of doctrine, there are 3 doctrines accepted and propagated by the church from that time onward, which have had the greatest single effect in promoting anti-Semitism. And I want to specify them because doctrine is important. Some people act as if doctrine doesn't matter. That's not true. Because what you teach people ultimately will come out in the way they live. And if you teach people wrong, ultimately they'll live wrong. Now, these are 3 established doctrines of the church, promoted by, the first 2 of them promoted by St. Augustine, the third one by others. The first doctrine is that the church is the true Israel. Israel is no longer Israel, the church is Israel. Now, that is very widely taught in the contemporary charismatic movement, and it really is the source of anti-Semitism. Because once they've lost their identity, then you're free to do anything you like to them. After all, they deserve it. Then St. Augustine also tried to solve the problem of why the Jews continue to exist as a people when they've been so wicked. And his conclusion was that God permits them to exist as a perpetual witness of the curse that comes upon those who reject Jesus. So that is their theological function, to be a perpetual witness to the church and to all of the curse that results from disobeying God and rejecting Jesus. The implication is, if you add to the curse, you're just helping God. And the third, which is the most deadly of all, is that the Jews were guilty of deicide. Not homicide, that's manslaughter, but deicide, killing God. And this is such a horrendous crime that you can do anything to people who have committed it. They deserve anything you do to them, and worse. Now, the results of that kind of teaching in the early period of the church, up to and through the 4th century, are stated this way. There are too many signs that stake out the permanence, the importance, and the gravity of Christian anti-Semitism. And these are the things that it produced in those centuries. Contempt, calumny, animosity, segregation, forced baptisms, appropriation of children, unjust trials, pogroms, exiles, systematic persecutions, theft and rapine, hatred, open or concealed, social degradation. And you need to understand why forced baptisms and appropriation of children go together. Because according to the understanding of baptism at that time, if a person was baptized by what we would call christening, he had become a Christian. And so if you took Jewish children and baptized them, even without the approval of their parents, they then became Christians. And it was illegal for a Jew to raise Christian children. So you had to take the children from them. You understand? That's the way this thing worked. Then we go on to a later period, the period of the First Crusade, which was 1096. Now you know the word crusade comes from the Latin word crux, for a cross. So a crusade is a war fought for the cross. And the horrendous crimes that have been committed in the name of crusade would be too long to mention if I spoke all evening. I am always deeply concerned when I hear Christians call any kind of Christian gathering a crusade. Because in the eyes of both Jews and Muslims, it's the most wicked thing that they've ever been subjected to. When the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem the first time, I think in 1093, I'm not sure, they found a congregation of Jews gathered in a synagogue, and they burnt the synagogue down with all the Jews inside. They also massacred all the Muslims that they could find. All this in the name of Christ. So never go to the Middle East with a crusade. Because you start, as they say in America, with 2 strikes against you. Now this is a description of what happened in the First Crusade. The Crusaders were going to the Holy Land to deliver it from the infidels, the Muslims and the Jews. But on the way through Europe, they said to themselves, listen, we've got infidels amongst us who are worse than any of those in the Holy Land, the Jews. So let's deal with them first before we ever get to the Holy Land. So they dealt with them with massacres all throughout the course of the Crusades through Europe. And this is a little description of some of the massacres. The general pattern of all massacres was the same. The perpetrators were the pauperes, the poor men, who formed a sort of advance guard for the more disciplined crusaders under Godfrey. The Jews were stoutly defended by the bishops, with a few exceptions, also by town authorities, the clergy, and in many places by the people themselves. We need to take note of the fact that the Catholic hierarchy very many times did not approve of anti-Semitism, but they were powerless to prevent it. The problem was they taught something which, when they saw the fruits of it, they couldn't change. So this is a description. The massacres were clearly mob action, reinforced by religious fanaticism. In most cases, a few Jews were baptized voluntarily. More again were baptized by force. Many were killed, and there were numerous suicides, because many Jews, being confronted with compulsory baptism, would commit suicide rather than be baptized. From January to July of 1096, it is estimated that up to 10,000 died, probably 1/4 to 1/3 of the Jewish population of Germany and northern France at the time. That is the pathway of the First Crusade on its way to deliver the Holy Land. Then we'll go on a little further. You have to be very patient with me because this is very complicated to deliver this kind of message. In the 12th century, the 1100s and onward, two new forms of attack were developed against the Jews. The first was they were accused of ritual murder. And it was told that to celebrate their religious rites, they had to have the blood of a Christian, preferably a Christian child. Anybody who knows the Jews would know that nothing would be more abhorrent to them than the blood of a Christian child. They couldn't think of anything. But these people were so superstitious they believed this. And so whenever a Jewish child was found dead, it was generally believed that the Jews had killed that child for the sake of using the blood in their religious ceremonies. And there are 150 cases reported in history from that time onwards of this kind of what we call blood libel. And in most cases they led to murders and massacres. Then the next form of slander was that they were guilty of desecrating the host, that is, the emblems in the Catholic Church of the communion. And it was widely reported that they took these emblems and used them in blasphemous ceremonies. And 100 cases have been reported from that time until now. And I actually saw in the Osservatore Romano, which is the Roman Catholic Italian journal, in this century, still reports of such cases. So it's lasted from 1100 through the 20th century. Now, concerning this author says about it, the ritual murder calumny stands in the judgment of history as the most monstrous instrument of anti-Jewish persecution devised in the Middle Ages. To its account must be laid many of the tortures, forced baptisms, exiles, and massacres of that and later ages. Its inception in the 12th century, moreover, indicates the course the Jewish image was taking. Unbeliever and usurer, now ritual murderer. Gradually stripped of his human features, the Jews assumes a satanic guise. Generally speaking, when one group of people really wants to harm another group, they have to get them classified as somehow less than human. And then anything you do is all right. This happened, of course, in this country at one time to the blacks and also to the Native Americans. And both of them suffered fearfully from that process. But their sufferings are minimal by comparison with those of the Jews. But the principle is the same. These people are no longer human. It doesn't matter what you do with them. Ruth and I in 1981 rented an apartment in Jerusalem from a Jewish couple who came from Czechoslovakia and had survived the Holocaust. They survived because they were protected by a Czech farmer. He wasn't really pro-Jewish, but he thought about them like dogs. Well, they're good and healthy. It would be a shame to kill a healthy dog if you could keep it alive. And they told us in one place, they heard a conversation about a group of people in a truck. And the people said, how many people are there in the truck? And they said, 9 people and 3 Jews. Can you see the implication of that? It takes a little while to sink in. Jews are not people. So when you deal with them, you're not doing anything to people. Then we have a new attack that comes forth, which is they were accused of poisoning the wells throughout Europe. The following year, there sprang up a new legend that Jews, in league with the king of Tunis and other infidel rulers, that's Muslims, had conspired with the lepers to exterminate Christianity by poisoning wells with a secret formula, reported to be composed of urine, herbs, human blood, and a sacred host, revealed by the lepers under torture. The legend took a heavy toll. In many places, arrests were made and many Jews were tortured and killed. In Chinon, France, 160 Jews were cast into a pit and burned. 5,000 in all were reported killed on the basis of this rumor that they had conspired with the Muslims to poison the wells of the Christians. And then comes another tremendous disaster in the years 1347 to 1350, which we know as the Black Death. I know Americans are not, as a whole, very familiar with European history, but I imagine most of you have at least heard of the Black Death, which was a plague that struck Europe between the years of 1347 and 1350. Reportedly, it was carried by rats. I don't think that's ever been confirmed. And about 1/3 of the population of Europe died in those years. And no one knew how to deal with the plague. So what to do? Whom to blame? Blame the Jews. Why not? So we read this. The Black Death was one of humanity's epochal scourges. For Jews, it was a tragedy, to which after the fall of Jerusalem, only the horrors of 1096 and 1939 were comparable. 1939, the beginning of the Holocaust. For 3 hellish years, Jewish communities all over Europe were torn to pieces by a populace crazed by the plague, which, before it ended, carried off 1/3 of the population. Bewildered by the plague's ravages, people looked for a cause. Before long, the inevitable scapegoat was found. Who else but the arch-conspirator and poisoner, the Jew? This time, too, the weird formula for well poisoning, elicited by torture, was disclosed. A concoction of lizards, spiders, frogs, human hearts, and, to be sure, sacred hosts. The story that the Jews in Spain had circulated the death-dealing drug to poison the wells of all Christendom spread like wildfire. It was first believed in southern France, where the entire Jewish population of a town was burned. From there, the deathly trail led into northern Spain, then to Switzerland, into Bavaria, up the Rhine, into eastern Germany, and to Belgium, Poland, and Austria. It is impossible to determine the extent of Jewish casualties during these years. In all, over 200 Jewish communities, large and small, were destroyed. The massacres were greatest in Germany, where every sizable city was affected, and perhaps least in Austria because of the wholehearted intervention of Albert II, who was the ruler of Austria. One may imagine the scope of the tragedy by the 10,000 casualties reported in Poland, where they were comparatively light. Well over 10,000 were killed in Erfurt, Mainz, and Breslau alone. Now we come to a very important conclusion of all this. As a result of now, let's say 6 or 7 centuries of deliberate slander and attack. Of grave significance was the utter deterioration of the Jewish image in the late Middle Ages. The dissociation of the imaginary from the real Jew, effected earlier under theological influence, was now complete. The terms Jewish and diabolical had become all but synonymous. The deliberate unbeliever and blasphemer, that's the Jew, was now also ritual murderer and poisoner of mankind, arch-conspirator, oppressor of the poor, sorcerer, and magician. In short, the agent of Satan. Medieval art gave plentiful evidence of the figure. Invariably, the Jew was portrayed with horns, a tail, an evil visage. His company is that of devils, sows, scorpions, and his poses grotesque. The image was further elaborated by men of letters, preachers, and apologists, and was seized upon as a motive in popular aggressions. Finally, medieval anti-Semitism was a mob phenomenon. Superstitious and bloodthirsty elements among the masses, suffering under the lash of socio-political and natural calamities, found in the Jew the scapegoat needed to rationalize the evils of their lot. Fresh from barbarism, much of the population was incapable of understanding fully the nature of evil, and the evil less capable of putting into practice the Christian ideal of universal love. Now, I have to say that I think it must be laid at the door of the church that they never really combated those lies. Sometimes the church leadership did not go along with it, but they never effectively combated the result of the lies which they themselves had originally sown. The traumatic experience of these years left its mark on the Jew. In a certain sense, a Jewish mentality was born. To their persecutors, Jews reacted with cold fury, recoiling still further into themselves from an adversary no longer considered human. That's the Christians. Truly malicious references to things Christian appeared in Jewish writers, and the cross became a symbol of disaster. Bear that in mind. For the Jews, the ultimate enemy symbolized by the cross. That's why I think it's unwise for zealous Christians to put a cross and the Star of David together, because it's a howling blasphemy to Jewish people. An unbridgeable chasm between Christian and Jew was dug, a chasm the Jews as well as the Christians sought to widen. To Christians, Jews, degraded, were looked upon as living proof of the malediction they were supposed to bear. Christians did not see that this despised Jews was in large part of Christian making. A certain commentator says this: if the Jew in literary description by the Christian and in common imagination is often a cringing and despicable figure, it should be remembered how he became so far as he did actually become so. The traits of characters are those which the Christian ancestors of the one bred in the Jewish ancestors of the others. Now we come to Martin Luther. And this, I think, will shock some of you. Some of you are probably aware. I made a startling discovery in 1946 when I was learning Hebrew with the then secretary of the Hebrew University. And as a Christian, I said something to him about Martin Luther. And he said very deferentially, but firmly, he said, you have to know that the Nazis used the writings of Martin Luther to promote their plan to liquidate the Jews. Later on, when I was writing my book, The Last Word on the Middle East, I tried to obtain some of Luther's writings to put in the book to substantiate what I was saying. But the passage that I found was so vulgar and so scurrilous that I would not put it in my book. Now, I'll read some of the things. Originally, when Martin Luther parted company with the Catholic Church, he believed that the Jews would flock to his new version because it was pure. When they didn't, as with Muhammad earlier, he turned against them because they had rejected his movement. And this is how it goes. When Jews did not meet his expectations, that's Luther's, or worse, when some of his followers showed tendencies to Judaize, Luther's attitude toward Jews took a dark turn. In 1542, he published a tract concerning the Jews and their lives, in which he raged at them in a language that is at least equal in violence anything uttered against them before or after. With biting sarcasm and occasional scatologic insult, He renewed all the old charges of the past. Now, you may be like me. I didn't know what scatological was. I thought maybe it got something to do with eschatological. I looked it up in the dictionary. It means anything that deals with excrement. These are the charges. Jews are poisoners, ritual murderers, usurers. They are parasites on Christian society. They are worse than devils. It is harder to convert them than Satan himself. They are doomed to hell. They are, in truth, Antichrist. Their synagogues should be destroyed and their books seized. They should be forced to work with their hands. Better still, they should be expelled by the princes from their territories. Such were his outpourings, though in fairness it must be noted that his diatribes were interspersed with a random prayer and merciful word for Jews. During his last years, Luther made repeated efforts to have the German princes oppress or expel Jews. In his last sermon, delivered a few days before his death, he called urgently for their expulsion from all Germany. What a tragedy, isn't it? To die with that almost on your lips. What a warning to all of us. A man who had seen more of the truth than any man of his generation, and yet carried away with this satanic deception. Then we'll turn to Poland just for a moment. Poland at this time was comparatively a place of refuge for many Jews, but it didn't continue that way. It says about a period between 1648 and 1658, again the Jews were caught in a crossfire. In the Ukraine, the Eastern Orthodox Cossacks, now you know Eastern Orthodox is the Russian version of Christianity, they were Christians, hated not only the Polish Catholics who oppressed them, but also their middlemen of alien faith, the Jews. In April 1648, under Bogdan Chmielewski, their hetman, they allied themselves with the Tatars and the Zaporozhtis, that's non-Christians. So here we have two Christian groups, the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics, allied with the non-Christians against whom? Guess whom? The Jews. And they ravaged Poland in a most barbarous fashion, reserving their worst cruelties for the Jews. Margulis and Marx described their happenings. I'm going to read this very carefully, because it made such an impression on me. And remember, this is all being done in the name of Christianity. Estates were devastated, manor houses reduced to ashes, and human beings barbarously done to death. The victims were flayed and burned alive, mutilated and left to the agony of a lingering death. Infants were slit like fish, or slaughtered at the breasts of their mothers, or cast alive into wells. Women were ripped open and then sewed up again with live cats thrust into their bowels. Many, married or unmarried, were violated before the eyes of their menfolk, and those that were comely were carried away. I think I'm going to read a little bit of that again, because I don't think it sinks in the first time. The victims were flayed and burned alive, mutilated and left to the agony of a lingering death. Infants were slit like fish, or slaughtered at the breasts of their mothers, or cast alive into wells. Women were ripped open and then sewed up again with live cats thrust into their bowels. Many, married or unmarried, were violated before the eyes of their menfolk, and those that were comely were carried away. It's estimated that in those years between 100,000 and 500,000 Jews perished, and it's impossible to get accurate estimates. 700 Jewish communities were totally destroyed. Now you pass to what would you say? Rationalism. And you say, well, here are the rationalists, at least they'll have a more rational view of Jews. Not a bit. It's the most amazing thing. Voltaire, who was the leader of the assault on the Christian church and the Christian faith, was equally evil towards the Jews. And this is what he said. This great liberator from superstition actually approved the endless persecutions and massacres of the Jews and gave credence to their blood accusation. No insult to Jews was too gross. Jews are, Voltaire ranted, the most imbecile people on the face of the earth, enemies of mankind, a people most obtuse, cruel, and absurd, whose history is disgusting and abominable. In short, we find in them only an ignorant and barbarous people who have long united the most sordid avarice with the most detestable superstition and the most invincible hatred for every people by whom they are tolerated and enriched. Those are the words of Voltaire. Then we pass to the end of the 19th century, and the main scene shifts to Russia. And at the end of the 19th century and on into the 20th century, frequent pogroms swept across Russia. Some say that they were actually organized by the Tsars, but it's certain that the Tsars tolerated them and they were coordinated. Now, the in-laws of Ruth's first husband came from the Baltic as Jews. When Ruth was converted to Judaism, before she was a believer in Jesus, in 1952, I think, the rabbi told her at that time, the fact that you married a Jew doesn't mean you have to become a Jew. Think carefully, because you don't know what may await you. It can mean a gas chamber, it can mean torture, it can mean execution. Just don't be hasty. But she decided and was converted. And her in-laws told her that at that period in the Baltic and in Russia, the times that the Jews feared most were the Christian holidays, especially Easter and Christmas. And at that time they would go into hiding. They would go down into the cellars and hide themselves because the largely drunken Christian populace would sweep through the Jewish communities, just destroying everything they found. This is a description of the first pogrom. The first great pogrom commenced on Easter of 1881 and spread rapidly through southern Russia. 100 Jewish communities were struck. Masses of Jews were maimed, murdered, and impoverished as the police stood idly by. The attacks occurred almost simultaneously and followed the same general pattern everywhere. So now we're into the 20th century. And in 1905, an unknown Russian anti-Semite published a thing which has later been called the Protocols of Zion. How many of you have heard of them? Well, this claimed to be a secret document that this person had discovered, describing the meeting of 24 Jewish elders, how they came together and plotted to overthrow all civilized society and take dominion over the world. And this was not first widely believed, but in 1919 it was widely circulated and has reached probably millions of people. And you'll find many people, some here in the United States, others in Europe, in Germany, that really believe these protocols are an authentic historic document, although they have been classified as totally unhistoric by all the people who researched them. The interesting thing for Americans is that Henry Ford, in his paper, The Dearborn Independent, which had a circulation of 700,000, endorsed and circulated these reports of the Protocols of Zion. Not only that, but a revised, abbreviated edition was published and circulated in many languages throughout many nations. Eventually, under pressure from Jewish people, Henry Ford recanted and renounced, and he said he had done wrong. But by that time, hundreds of thousands of copies of these reports had circulated in his name to hundreds and millions of people around the earth. He had scattered the seed, and there was no way he could take control of it again. Now, at the end of World War I, when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, there was a civil war of about 2 years. between what was known as the White Army and the Red Army. The Red Army was Bolshevists, the White Army was more or less Orthodox Russian Christianity. And this is a little account of what happened at that time. The White Army viewed the Orthodox Jews as Bolsheviks, which was the most absurd thing, because for an Orthodox Jew, Bolshevism was totally reprehensible. I mean, they rejected it totally. But nevertheless, thousands of them were put to death by the White Army as Bolsheviks. And it says this: the worst excesses occurred in the Ukraine under Hetman Pletyura and General Denikin, where the Orthodox Jewish masses, to whom Bolshevism was a godless abomination, were put to the sword as Bolshevists. And here's a description of what they did. It's somewhat similar to Poland. To save ammunition, soldiers often used only cold steel. Thus, the Jews were literally butchered by the thousands. The troops went systematically to work, street by street, and the butchers, or ravishers as the case might be, distinguished themselves by a bestiality scarcely ever surpassed. It was considered a mercy by the Jews to be killed outright instead of being gradually tortured to death. A father gave all he possessed that his son might only be shot. Parents were forced to witness the torturing of their children, and children that of parents. And all this was done in the name of Christianity, bear that in mind, by people professing to be Orthodox Christians.